you'll send an email
Okay.
too, though, right?
Okay, now everything you say will be recorded.
It can't be held against you in
Okay,
court.
it could be held.
Yes.
The court of law. So I want to welcome everybody. These have just turned out to be great conversations, I think. And I was just talking with Howard that last week's I just thought was so wonderful because it was so vibrant, you know, going all over the place. So after talking about, Esther, was this vibrant conversation, and then the wisdom literature, of course. I just find that wisdom literature so rich but easy to get into the conversation. So it'll be interesting today about who wants to talk about sex. Because the Song of Solomon.
Yeah, it's
We already lost somebody. It's a different level of conversation, right? Which makes this book quite fascinating. In fact, in the old Jewish world, they didn't want anyone reading this book until they were 35 years old. And only the men,
Right.
So in the middle of wisdom literature, this is wisdom literature.
Wow.
Dominated by David and Solomon. Solomon is the initiator of wisdom literature, right? The wisest man. So we have to start with the conversation. Did Solomon write it? Is this, it says sometimes this is labeled, does anyone have it? Song of Songs?
Yes.
Is that what yours is?
It's on the Bible Project.
Okay, and who has Song of Solomon?
Lutheran Bible says that.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I have Song of Solomon, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. That's the first line. So that's sort of how, so we know it's connected to Solomon. That's interesting. And yet commentators, that's our first question, you can see up on the board. Is this written by a man who had 700 wives and 300 concubines?
You wouldn't have time.
That's a good point.
Very fine
There
point.
were inspirational women. How did he choose his women?
Well, part of and I've always bothered me, even as a kid, why more wives than concubines? Makes no sense. Why not have 700 concubines?
That was kind of odd, yeah.
But that's, we know the wives, it was a contract, often a political contract. So to sign to say, we've got a relationship between our two countries, will you marry my daughter? We know this got Solomon in hot water with the temple, because when all these wives come in, they of course want to continue their worship of their local deities. So all around Jerusalem, if you've been there, there's these mountains, and he would allow each of them to build a temple to their gods on those mountains, so that they could go up on the mountain periodically and pay their respects, their worship to their local god. So if you've got 700 wives all building temples to their gods, all surrounding Zion. So if you've been there, the mountains kind of surround the one Mount Zion, where the Temple Mount is today. So basically, you've almost got a Roman situation, a Roman pantheon or a Greek pantheon, where you've got all this temple worship to all the gods, very polytheistic. Now, Solomon might defend himself and saying, I'm just, happy wife, happy life, 700, that means I've got a lot of negotiating to do. But it becomes, the prophets later on become very critical of him because he allowed polytheistic worship into Jerusalem, and especially in Jerusalem, not just out in the countryside. So that's a long way of saying you got a big harem, which would reflect the normal practice of the day, right? Mostly political, but not just political. And remember from Esther, how long were you in training to be in the harem?
Yeah,
2 years,
Was it, Esther was 2 years?
2 years.
1 or 2, I don't think it was
I thought it was
one.
one.
Yeah, you're probably right.
And what was part of the training?
Oh, massages, spa treatments, everything.
A year of spa treatment, but also, they don't mention it as much, but it was also to learn the
Oh,
protocols,
Yeah.
policies, behaviors, etiquette.
How to get along with each other.
Sure.
And that was often controlled by eunuchs. So eunuchs would control the harems and I'm not sure all the stuff from Jerusalem, but you read a lot of this in the Far East in Turkey, that the harems were highly controlled. These women, it wasn't a plush life at all. In fact, it was kind of brutal and oppressive because their sole affection had to be toward the king. Now think about that. And you're sharing the sole affection of the king with 700 women. So you can imagine it wasn't a very pleasant social life.
1 day every 2 years, yeah.
One day every 2 years. But you had to be loyal.
Yeah.
So now if you're sneaking off at night, right,
Whoa.
you can get in a lot of trouble.
Right.
Right? So your whole existence was about loyalty, and then can you attract him enough for a night a year?
Well, Rick, is there another strategic move to this, though, to go out and populate the world with my family so that we retain a powerful family? Usually there's another game being played there.
Yeah, yes, but it's a very serious game because any child I have then has, depending on who the wife was or the concubine, has a right to the throne. So that's why this was all controlled with eunuchs, because was it the king's offspring? Was it some interloper coming in and now?
Of course, now you've also got a better choice of who is going to be your successor if you decide it's not going to be the firstborn.
Yeah.
And so maybe you get a better choice of successor king, which in kings and judges, we see the lines of succession are terrible.
And there's also, if I spread my seed far and wide, it's harder for another opposing king to come in and destroy my family. So in business terms, it's diversifying your portfolio. Because that's often the first thing someone would do is take out your family. Right? They had to kill your offspring because they didn't want anyone with a claim to the throne. So this gets them quite complex about, how do I do this and do it in a responsible way? Or the kids, we have that with the 3 Herods, right? The Herod the Great, when Jesus is born, has 3 kings. He says, not any of my boys are capable of running the business. And so I'm going to split up that whole region into 3. So you have 3 Herods now, all with their father's name, which is hard then to distinguish them. So by the time of Jesus dies, you have 3 Herods, not 1. And they're all terribly brutal. So they're not just killing off their own kids, they're killing off the nieces and the nephews, anybody who might have a claim to their throne. And if you're the wife, you still have to stay in good graces or you get killed as well.
Exactly.
Because the wife had huge power and influence over her boys.
This is Agrippa and Nero. And Agrippa was the wife or the mother of Nero, and he actually ended up killing her. And then blame it on the Christians.
Why not?
I have a question.
Yes,
The logistics, where on earth did they house 700 wives and all the,
Solomon was the richest man to ever live.
yeah, Solomon was, that's right, Solomon's supposed to be the richest man ever lived, that's his reputation, whether he was, probably not, but boy, he had resources. And so that was part of the economics of the day. It was all surrounded the royal family. And so there were building projects, there were, aqueducts, royal palaces, public works, but there was also the harem. You know, and if you think about setting up your progenitor, your line of rule, you're willing to invest a lot in that. Look how much we invest in our election system. Right? We invest a lot in elections or in candidates in our parties. So, yeah. And it wasn't just feeding them, it was like the royal court. So when Solomon would put on a big party, yeah, although as we found out with Esther, not everybody was invited to every party. So there's still, I always think of the French court of Louis the 16th. You know,
Yeah.
there was a lot of intrigue that went on at court, and who got invited to which party, and it was a big deal. So my guess is only certain of the women or the concubines were invited to certain parties. You know. We want to know more, but you can read more about harems. There's quite a bit in Turkish literature, in Japanese literature, Chinese literature. They've all had harems and wrote about them extensively. Like I said, it was not a picnic.
There are also, for those who binge watch on TV, on Netflix and Amazon Prime, there are numerous series on the Turkish harems and all those things, which my wife finds fascinating. So I know about.
She volunteering for harem, is that it?
I don't
She's
watch
thankful
the harem
to be
shows,
here.
but my wife watches.
Yeah.
And she reports.
So what do the Mormons figure out? Usually there's more than sex that's involved in harems. There's usually some strategic power move that's going on. So did the Mormons have, they had a philosophy about this?
Now, that's more biblical. I think that's, having multiple wives was, and probably will be in the future, emerges when there's war. For example, you got the Ukrainians now. How many families have been destroyed? How many of the men have, because they had to go back to war. And so that leaves a wife often, or a young person, and there are no men. There's just no men. And in that environment, you work things out for a while, and then you realize maybe this isn't the best. Once there's more equity, then you say, okay, but this isn't good for relationship, but it might be a good system for survival. Bible doesn't condemn polygamy. At certain points, that was the only way you could make it, and especially in a farm culture, the more boys, so the more kids are out there working the farm, probably the better. So it was an economic move more than love, personal relationship. So that kind of leads us to the first question: did Solomon write it or not? Commentators are mixed on this. Many say, how can a man with 700 wives write about this love relationship with one woman, and vice versa? And somehow I think you could, as I was just saying, I think you could reverse that and say, maybe with all those wives, he was drawn to the relationship, maybe that he had back in the day, or maybe he's thinking about his dad with Bathsheba.
Or maybe they're co-authoring this. There's a very, very distinct possibility that he was, not just having a sexual relationship with them, but he was also trying to have some kind of deeper meaning and asking them to contribute to this.
Well, you'll have this. We're going to read the first chapter. So if you've got a Bible with you, to open up to chapter 1, and you can see the back and forth between the man and the woman here. So it's love poetry, and in the archaeological digs now, they're finding quite a bit of this love poetry there in the area. So this was a genre. It'd be like us having love poetry. We love love poems are just wonderful. And obviously in their day, they love poetry as well. So we're going to read this. The beginning, we'll read to 8, if someone can lead us off, but it's the colloquy of the bride and friends. So a woman should read the first one up through 8, and then we'll switch over and read 9 to the end, and that should be a man. And you're gonna get the back and forth here.
Let him kiss me with kisses of his mouth, for your love is more delightful than wine. Pleasing is the fragrance of your perfume. Your name is like perfume poured out. No wonder the young women love you. Take me away with you. Let us hurry. Let the king bring me into his chambers. We rejoice and delight in you. We will praise your love more than wine. How right they are to adore you. Dark am I, yet lovely, daughters of Jerusalem, dark like the tents of Kedar, like the tent curtains of Solomon. Do not stare at me because I am darkened by the sun. My mother's sons were angry with me and made me take care of the vineyards. My own vineyard I had to neglect. Tell me, you whom I love, where you raised your flock and where you rest your sheep at midday. Why should I be like a veiled woman beside the flocks of your friends? If you do not know, most beautiful of women, follow the tracks of the sheep and graze your young goats by the tents of the shepherds.
Okay, this is all flowery, some allegorical language, so, you know, when we're talking about flocks, we're not talking about flocks. When we're talking about sheep, we're not talking about sheep, okay? This is-
I have a question.
Yeah,
My Bible has she, it also has friends in a couple of places, almost like a chorus. And then he.
So the dark one says
Yeah.
black. Yeah.
I took this because you're gonna see this with the man's colloquy too. I think they want to say that when I see you among your friends, you're the fairest. And all your friends love you the most, right? You're the, I think it's a, what would we say? You know, when all the girls are together, not only do I prefer you, but even they recognize how wonderful, you know, you are. And the man's gonna be the same way, where his friends are gonna recognize him also as kind of the star football player. And here you have maybe the cheerleader, you know, the head cheerleader, whatever it is, but it's that sort of feeling as far as the way I've been reading it so
I
far.
think she's right though, about this is the chorus.
Yeah.
This is very Greek, you know, you've always got the Greek chorus
Yes.
coming back, you know, sort of filling in the blanks or creating the continuity in the story.
So if that's a great insight. So if she's saying you're the fairest, you can imagine then all the girls behind her saying, oh, yes, you're the fairest. Even we recognize you're the fairest, right? Yeah, that's good.
And I think there's another insight that's coming to me on this one. I'll bet that what Solomon did is he said, the requirement to be in my harem, you have to write poetry. So he's actually making this kind of like a higher standard that this isn't just about sex, you got to write poetry too. And so that's how you get, I think, probably how you create this is using that as a requirement. How's that for a
I can
theory?
see that. I'd have to look at that. I haven't read that in the commentaries, but it makes sense to me that, especially if that was part of the wooing process. Because part of it, obviously, is, you can see that here, the skin color
Mhm.
is important. And, you know, we always change in our view of beauty. Here, dark was not beautiful because it meant you were out in the fields, you were served.
You're Negro.
Now, it's really beautiful because that means you have the luxury of sitting around the pool and getting a tan. You don't have to work. Because if you're working, you're gonna be pale. So it's usually tied with the luxury of time. And so it goes from being a dark skin to light skin, depending on the culture.
My grandmother said when she was young, they would put lemon juice on their arms to bleach them and then put stockings so that they wouldn't be known as anybody who had to work outside.
That's right.
We used to use baby oil and not a good idea. I was kidding. Let's do the opposite. Yeah, do the opposite.
Rick, suppose the application is part of your harem. Okay, this is, you know, I got to apply. He just says, you know, how do you get into the inside? Well, you got to apply to come in, and suppose the application said, you know, you have to write a love poem as part of the application to get into the harem.
I don't know if you had to write it to get in, but to woo the king, you know, there's a lot of things that you might want to do. We know dancing was one of those things. My guess is, like the harems in Japan, it was, what's your entertainment value? Can you play a musical instrument? Can you dance?
Mhm.
Can you sit down with the king for a couple hours and have a good conversation about whatever? So that was part of the training, obviously, was skin treatment, sure, spa treatment, sure. But I bet there was a lot of, not just etiquette, but social conversation. Can you, do you connect with the king? What does he like to talk about? I'm sure they would share those things. Now, a man, start with 9. Who could read this next section? 9 through 17.
You want to read it?
Now, go ahead, Matt. You got it.
I compare you, my love, to a mare among Pharaoh's chariots. Your cheeks are comely with ornaments, your neck in strings of jewels. We will make you of ornaments of gold studded with silver. While the king was on his couch, my nard gave forth its fragrance.
That was a she. What?
Yeah.
She speaks now.
She, while the king was.
Yeah, excuse me, it's the colloquy of the bridegroom, yeah.
Yeah.
While the king was on his couch.
No,
Like-
here. That's in the bridegroom. Okay, keep going.
Where do you want me to start? Okay. My nard gave forth in fragrance. My beloved is to me as a bag of myrrh that lies between my breast. My beloved is to my cluster of a henna blossoms in the vineyards of a Gedi. Yeah, and you are beautiful, my love. Ah, you are beautiful. Your eyes are doves. Ah, you are beautiful, my beloved, truly love. Our couch is green. The beams of our house are cedar. Our rafters are pine. Do I stop there?
Yeah.
Okay. I guess I need better glasses.
Yeah.
I guess I need.
So other than confusing who's talking, and which metaphors, you get the feel here that this is going to be about romantic love, which is interesting because wisdom literature, we know, we've been reading, covers all the bases of life. And yet in the church, because of our Puritan backgrounds or a pietism, what was one subject we can almost never talk about within the framework of God?
Sex.
So Rick, there's a puzzlement here for me. The Song of Songs is obviously, about love, but there's another missing book, which was in the Apocrypha, which actually was in Martin Luther's Bible, that came out in the Septuagint, which is called the Wisdom of Solomon.
Mhm.
And it was left out of the Old Testament, and they left this one in, but the Wisdom of Solomon is fascinating because he has a love affair with Sophia, the Holy Spirit, but it's purely a spiritual love affair, not anything that looks like this, but that got left out. Any thoughts?
Yeah.
Actually, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I looked at my King James Bible. I think I'm reading poetry. I'll go there. And they talk about the love of Christ and the church. All of the little notes above the verses talk about the relationship of Christ and the church.
That's because we can't talk about sex.
I know.
So, let's just be clear. The Jewish commentators for 2,000 years have always talked about this is about the relationship between God and Israel.
Okay.
So you want to go to allegory because dealing with the actual romantic language makes us a little squeamy in the church. And so we jump quickly to allegory. And Christians then took that same tack. Instead of talking about God and Israel, we talked about Christ and the church, which is fine, as long as, first of all, you're talking about romance and sex. I mean, you can't use it as an allegory to start with. You first of all have to deal with the text itself. And obviously the writer is not talking about Christ here. And I would say even not talking, first of all, about the divine relationship with Israel. I think wisdom literature talks about every aspect of life and is trying to describe something beautiful in framing it within the divine context, but talking about romance first romance,
Romantic love.
then you can go allegory as a secondary move.
Mhm.
But you can't go and just say, I'm not comfortable talking about a woman's breasts in public. So I'm gonna talk about Christ. Oh, but what? So I think the Jewish community knew this. That's why they wouldn't let only men, by the way, women weren't allowed to read the Song of Solomon. The men only when they're 35, which meant probably were married. I don't know.
They were grandparents.
Yeah, 35.
Now we're talking about the birds and the bees. Now that you're a grandparent, now we can explain some things too. So it's kind of interesting. So again, I think this gives, remember with the lament psalms, how we're uncomfortable with them as well. Because I often get pretty brutal. Like Psalm 139. I wish the children's heads of my
Completely intimate.
but it gives divine language to often authentic feelings. And here it gives authentic, divine credence to romance.
Because Rick, I think that's the key element here that at least pops out to me, is that in the Greek, it would be called eros. But eros could be erotic, but it could also be romantic. You know, we've turned eros into erotic now, but in the old versions of this romantic love was a spiritual love. And I'm reading this as a spiritual love affair between people. And that it's a great, suppose more marriages look like this.
Sneaking around the garden.
Well, not with multiple partners, but I mean, really at a divine
It's
level.
not multiple partners here. This
No,
is, these are a man and a woman who are just in love with each other. So they're going to sneak around the garden. Now, some make reference to the garden, by the way, as going back to Adam and Eve. So in the garden, this is the way romance was in the garden, so to speak. And what we're saying is, because we don't usually think of Adam and Eve being romantically inclined. We just, at least I don't think, that's not where my head goes immediately. But here, there's sort of that image of, in the Garden of Eden, this is kind of what was expected. Romance was just part of a God's good creation, so to speak. And so this is framed.
There's a modern version of this. It's by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and I happen to have it here, like more by coincidence. But it's the beginning of a piece that I wrote on the 10 loves. And it's, how shall I love thee? Let me count the ways. And essentially she goes through the multi-dimensions of what this is. I'll read it if anybody wants me to, because I think you see the same thing.
Well, let's wait till, let's stick with the text and we'll come back to the.
But you notice in the book too, they never become completely intimate. They caress and stuff like that, but nothing really happens. And even she comes to the door and he's gone. And at the end, they just kind of, it never really happens, right? It never really.
They never do this.
Yeah.
Well
That's a good
put.
description. Well, do you know what I'm talking about? You know what I'm talking about? I'm keeping it PG, I'm keeping it PG.
I'm not quite sure none of that happened. My Bible doesn't come with hand gestures. But it would be like certain movies that are romantic movies where you see the romance, which is what we want to see. And we don't want to see the sex, we want to see the romance. Right. And so this would be more of, I think, like a PG-13,
Right,
maybe,
yeah.
or I don't know, whatever. Label is. Now, before we watched the film on this, I didn't have much of a relationship. I don't think I ever did a Bible study on Song of Solomon. But as some know who went to the memorial service for Nina, that the director of my theater group asked me to write a special song. Thanks. She wanted to write a special song for our wedding and didn't tell me what it was. So it was the first time I heard the song was when we were standing up front. And she took her verses from chapter 8. And I want to read those only because they're special to me. So who is that coming up from the wilderness? I'm starting with verse 5, 8 verse 5. And there's a certain apex to Song of Solomon, I think, which happens obviously here at the end of chapter 8. Who is that coming up from the wilderness, leaning upon her beloved? Under the apple tree I awakened you. There your mother was in labor with you. There she who bore you was in labor. I've always thought that was interesting, that there's always these references to here's where your life began,
Yeah.
you know.
The beginning. Yeah.
Some of you maybe grew up in rural towns, you know, where you grew up in a house and maybe you were to die in that house. I mean, all of life happened in that farmhouse or happened in that community. Everybody knew
Everybody.
everybody else. And here's that old apple tree, you know, remember that when
Oh, yes.
when we fell in love, and we used to sneak down to that apple tree and kiss at night, you know, is that, or down by the lake or wherever it was, you know, this has that sort of feel to it. Set me then, at verse 6, set me as a seal upon your heart. Seal, think about even as a tattoo today. You know, who people fall in love now. That was not my day, but now, if you'd fall in love with someone, to get a tattoo together would be something people would do, right?
But relationships don't last very long today, so a lot of people get that. It's not good.
Well, Teresa, you want to share your story about what you told your kids about tattoos? They were allowed to get tattoos until they were 18. That's all I remember you saying once.
Yeah,
Well, legally,
but they never got a tattoo, but that girl I had.
Your daughter.
Yeah, she fooled me.
Oh, no.
And so one day she had her bathing suit on
Oh.
and I saw this music note.
Oh.
And I said, well, what is that? And she said, oh yeah, that's my tattoo. So whatever that was, but it got up to but my son never tattoos and, but only that girl.
That girl.
That girl. That girl.
Because it's permanent. So
Yeah.
the reason you get the tattoo is because you say, oh, this is symbolic. This is permanent. My love
Yeah, so hers was for music, so.
for music. Okay.
I think we'll accept that one.
But the parents,
Single note's fine. It's not like we want to have like
but the parents is
Susan
sitting
on
there
there
going, you
a
know,
week later.
if you get a divorce, it's gonna cost you a lot of money to take off that card.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that says
Yeah.
Jeannie, and then now you with Margaret.
Yeah, there are a couple of funny comedies about, you know, fall in love with them with someone else and how to get rid of that tattoo. All right. So set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. For love is strong as death, passion fierce as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, a raging flame. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it out. If one offered for love all the wealth of one's house, it would be utterly scorned. Then he goes in to describe his sister.
Yeah.
Okay, this is one of the reasons I think Solomon may have written this, because his own wisdom said, you know, I could pay for any woman. And none of the women in the harem are really truly my love. So I think it's sort of a grieving Solomon, a wise older Solomon going, I don't have the relationship I want. I could buy all, you know, contracts, 700, you know, of one, 300 of another. And yet here, if one offered for love all the wealth of one's house, it would be utterly scorned.
Money can't buy it.
Money can't buy love. Right?
Money
All right, let's see let's get ready to see how they describe this unbelievable psalm. Do we ever use it in church?
No, not that I know of.
No, because you can imagine if someone read verse 8, we have a little sister and she
Yeah.
has no breasts.
No breast.
What shall we do for our sister on that day when she is spoken for? The word of the Lord.
Or my breasts were like.
Thanks be to God. You know, what are you gonna say there?
If I was a wall, my breasts were like towers.
I know.
My breasts-
And Alyssa's the
Yeah.
one, yeah.
I wouldn't read it.
I've never read it. But don't you think we, well, early Christians, they shunned this so much that illicit sex, etc., almost became highlighted in their minds, you know, and even Jimmy Carter said, you know, he lusted, etc. And it worked the reverse by not saying it. And, you know, like my growing up, oh my gosh, you couldn't have dancing. To be in somebody's arms, you would, you know, well, it was almost like it was scriptural. It was a vertical fulfillment of a horizontal desire.
I might have to have you repeat that again, just so we catch up. There's a metaphor there.
Dancing was a vertical fulfillment of a horizontal desire. It was
Okay.
like found in Isaiah.
I have to share that. Many of you know the college, Wheaton College.
Yes.
It was the bastion of really evangelical. It was one of the top liberal arts Christian colleges in Wheaton, and they shunned dance up until about 6, 7, 8 years ago, when they had their first dance on campus, first time in their, over 100-year history. And the kids, of course, on campus didn't think anything about it because, they'd all gone to public schools or whatever, and so dancing, but this was a national news moment. So all these cameras, all the news agencies were there filming these kids going into a dance in the gym, kind of ridiculous. And so the person who wrote the article quoted one of the teachers making a joke and said that, there's certain rules we have about sexuality here at Wheaton, and we don't allow premarital sex here on campus because it might lead to dancing. Okay.
I remember middle school, hands up, space between you. All that good stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, like.
Don't get too
Exactly.
close, right.
No bump and grind.
No. Back then.
Shoot.
The Song of Songs. It's a well-known but not so well understood book of the Bible. It's 8 chapters of love poetry. And while there is an introduction and a conclusion, the book doesn't have any kind of rigid literary design, and that's because it's a collection of poems. They're not meant to be dissected or taken apart. They're meant to be read as a flowing whole and simply enjoyed. The first line of the book tells us that it's the Song of Songs, which is a Hebrew idiom like the Holy of Holies or the King of Kings. It's a Hebrew way of saying the greatest thing. So this is the greatest song of all songs. Then we're told in the first line that this Song of Songs is of Solomon, which could mean that he is the author. His name does begin the book, after all. But as you read the poems, you discover that the main voice is that of a woman called the Beloved. And while there is also a male voice, it does not seem to be Solomon's. Solomon is mentioned a couple times in the poems, but he's never a speaker. And you do have to admit, Solomon is a very odd candidate as the author of this book, given the fact that he had 700 wives. Mm-hmm. For the lovers in the Song of Songs, they are the only ones in the world for each other. So the of Solomon likely means in the wisdom tradition of Solomon. He was known for his wisdom, his poetry, his love of learning about every part of life. And Solomon became the father of wisdom literature in Israel. And so his legacy is here carried on through a collection of love poems that explores the human experience of love and sexual desire. The opening poem introduces us to the basic theme of this book. We hear the voice of the young woman who delights in her man, a shepherd. Now, she's not married to him yet, but it becomes clear that they're engaged and they cannot wait to be together. From the introduction, the poems flow back and forth from the woman's voice to the man's, shifting from scene to scene without any kind of clear linear sequence or storyline. The poems move in these symphonic cycles, and key images and ideas get repeated and developed. So one of the basic themes uniting the poems is the intense desire that this couple has for each other, expressed through their constant seeking and finding. So after the opening poem, they're separated but on the hunt for one another. So the woman calls out, or she'll wake up from a dream or go looking for her lover, and more than once they'll find each other, they'll embrace, and then right when things start to get a bit racy, the scene will suddenly end and a new one will start. They're separated, looking for each other, and on it goes. Another repeated theme is the joy of the couple's physical attraction for one another. So multiple times they'll pause and describe each other with these elaborate metaphors. And here it's very helpful to know that these images and metaphors in Hebrew poetry are not primarily visual. If you try and paint a picture of these people based on the metaphors, you will end up with something that looks very, very strange. What you're supposed to do is reflect on the meaning of these images as they relate to the man and the woman. So you'll read through the poetic cycles, and the tension will keep building in their desire and joy and attraction. And this spiraling repetition is a poetic way of heightening and focusing on the mystery and power of sexual love. It all comes together in the conclusion, which pauses to summarize what these poems are all about. Love is as strong as death. Its passions are as severe as the grave. Its flashes are of fire, a divine flame. Many waters cannot extinguish love. Rivers cannot sweep it away. If one were to give all the wealth of one's house for love, he would be utterly scorned. The poem highlights the power and the intensity of love, how it's both beautiful but also dangerous. Like fire, love can destroy people if it's abused, or be life-giving if it's protected. Ultimately, love expresses the insatiable human longing to know and be fully known and desired by another. Love is one of the most transcendent and mysterious experiences in human life, and as a part of the Bible's wisdom tradition, this book says it's a gift from God. After this, there's an odd poem about Solomon trying to do what the previous poem just said was impossible, to buy love. The woman rejects Solomon's offer, and then the book concludes with the man and the woman. They're separate once more on the hunt for each other. He calls to hear her voice. She begs him to run away with her, and that's how the book ends. Just totally open-ended. But that's a lot like love, which never truly concludes, because there's always more to discover and pursue in your beloved. And so true love has no end, and neither does this book. Now, through history, the big question raised by the Song of Songs is, what on earth is love poetry doing in the Bible? There have been three main interpretations of this book throughout history. In Jewish tradition, it's been read as an allegory, each character a symbol. So the woman is Israel, the man is God, and their love is a symbol of the covenant between God and Israel made at Mount Sinai and the giving of the Torah. This view flowed into the Christian tradition, but the characters were swapped. So it's about Christ's love for his people, the church. And this interpretation was inspired by Paul's words in Ephesians 5, that a Christian husband's love for his wife is a symbol of Christ's love for the church. What's interesting is that in the last 100 years, archaeological discoveries among Israel's ancient neighbors in Egypt and Babylon has turned up all kinds of ancient love poetry that's very similar in language and imagery to the Song of Songs. We see that love poetry was a meaningful part of Israel's cultural environment, which has led most scholars today to view the Song of Songs as what it presents itself to be, an arrangement of Israelite love poetry reflecting on the divine gift of love. But that doesn't mean that it's only ancient love poetry. There's a key feature of these poems that sticks out when you read them as a part of the Old Testament, and that's the overwhelming use of garden imagery. There are powerful echoes of the Garden of Eden and the idyllic scene between the married couple in the early chapters of Genesis. So the image of the man and the woman naked and vulnerable, but completely unified and safe with one another. This resonates in the background of the Song of Songs. It's as if in these poems we are witnessing the love of a couple whose relationship is untainted by selfishness and sin. And so ultimately the song holds out hope that even though our own relationships are so often distorted by selfishness, love is a transcendent gift, and it's meant to point us to something greater, to the gift of God's love that will one day permeate and transform his beloved world. And that's what the Song of Songs is all about.
See, that's where I got all that.
Yes.
See, that's where I got all
That
that.
So what did you think? What were your takeaways as you watched this the first time or the second time? What are your impressions initially? Because my guess is most of us have not spent a lot of time doing Bible study in this book, right?
Right.
Okay.
I was impressed, like you said before, about the information here reflecting back into Genesis, the garden. I never saw that before.
No, that's new to me, and I like that
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah.
Mhm. Which makes sense. Have that in the temple, right, where the temple is decorated as the garden. So this is sort of that.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at relationship looked like in its pure form.
Reflecting an earlier conversation we had, it's also about the finite and the infinite. The finite being individuals in the real world, and the infinite being the love of God that's embraced inside it.
And he does point here, right, to Ephesians, where Paul uses the marriage metaphor to talk about Christ's relationship with the church. And we have that in the book of Revelation. We have that in our window, you know, the one when you walk in the middle right window in the sanctuary, where you have Jerusalem at the end times coming down like a bride for the bridegroom. And so all of a sudden now we take that role at the end of the book. But that is supposed to also be like the Garden of Eden in that sense. Although I think the Bible moves us along historically from a garden to a city, but it's still got a city with the Garden of Eden inside of it, I would say.
I thought at the very end was very interesting too, how other cultures had almost virtually the same story. That was kind of, I thought that was interesting. Like, how could they have the same story? I mean, maybe this wasn't the first time, maybe they didn't write it. That's true.
But it'd be like us writing a love poem today. Most of us have read a lot of love poems and, you know, along the way. And so, you know, we think naturally like our
Right.
culture teaches us to think. Now, my guess is if we pressed him on that, a lot of that love poetry would also have divine roots to it.
Okay.
And you even get that in Western literature as well, right? Because there's something so powerful about the love connection that you'd say, oh, this is divine, right? This and Paul's language, the two shall become one. Well, that's reflecting what's it called when you go outside of yourself.
Selfishness.
Transformation.
I'll get it tomorrow. It's hard. But the whole idea is you melt into the other person. You start losing your own identity. Ecstatic experience. X meaning you go outside yourself. All of a sudden you become one with this other person. And there's all sorts of poetic language to try to describe what's going on there. But there is something about the two becoming one. And we use that in the wedding literature. And of course, Paul's using that. But Paul wants to say, oh, and that's what happens with God. Charismatics talk about that ecstatic experience, right? Where all of a sudden you start losing yourself into God. The monastics would use that language, especially the mystics would use that language of a certain ecstatic experience. And almost everyone in the church can identify with that experience at one time or another. Maybe, you know, it's during Christmas or Easter, there's a certain hymn, and all of a sudden you start to lose yourself, right? I mean, you're just so into singing the song that all of a sudden, you know, it's like God is right there, and it's just this amazing experience, and then you don't want it to end. You know, what do you mean there's only 5 verses? You know, you want to, because, and it lasts for a little while, and then it goes.
Well, Aristotle called this synergy, and Seneca described friendship as two people in one soul.
Now, take the soul language and make it body language.
Mhm.
Because Paul, it's about body and soul, correct? It's not, and that's where Christians, we've been a little bit more both afraid of the body, but also in our literature, body plays more of a role. It's not just a soulful relationship, for example, in Song of Solomon. It's a physical attraction as well, which makes it, the two shall become one is not just soul.
Right.
Anything else that you pull out of the description, Edie?
I like I charge you, do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires. I think maybe we do to our young people disservice by not explaining this, that, you know, true love is wonderful, you know, and when two should become one, that is a wonderful thing.
And I think some of us, the way I read that, Edie, is sometimes you're not ready for each other.
Well, exactly. That, you know, it's awaken love until it is desired. I mean, and you're ready for it, you know, not just physical, but the spiritual too.
So some parents will have certain rules about dating.
Yeah.
For that reason, they'll say you're just not ready for a certain level.
And
I always
of course
tell
you
this-
think they're just all silly, you know, that's, you know, but.
But now we'd have an actual scripture to quote to say, oh, maybe you're not ready for. I always talk about my daughter here, and of course, I was just up with her in Chicago, and she met her husband, Jeff, and they really liked each other, but as friends. And so he took her out to dinner and expressed that he was more than friendship. He wanted her as a girlfriend. And she laughed and brushed it off
Oh.
and said, I have absolutely no desire along that line at all. They did that 8 years in a row. It was like a ritual that he would invite her out and say, my feelings for you have not changed. And she would laugh and say, my feelings for you have not changed. 8 times, the 8th time, I remember she was living with us in St. Paul. And she came back and she was devastated. She was crying. She was just really upset and thought, what happened on that date? You know, she says, I think I'm in love with him.
There you go.
Well, what happened? She says, I don't know. I mean, all of a sudden, the time was right. I guess we try to describe that the time was right for whatever reason. But you know, my daughter has a plan. You know, when she has a plan, she likes to stick with her plan, and her plan did not involve him. And then all of a sudden, love happens, and now you're confused. She was confused, upset. You know, I had him compartmentalized as a friend for the rest of my life, not, you know. So I've never asked him about that story. So I always
Get
want
his
to know,
version.
how did he have the confidence to stick with it for 8 years? That's a lot of rejection.
He loved her.
He did. But I want to hear him say that. You know, so, yeah, let's just get in groups now, and you might want to wander off the text here, but stay, first of all, what did you learn with Song of Solomon, right? But then I think we're sort of tempted to say, now, how would I use this book? How is this book the word of God for me? I mean, you were kind of leaning into that. There might be some texts here, even about relationships, that we could pull
I
out.
said love is a gift. from
I
God.
mean, would you do this Bible study in a high school group?
You'd have to ask for divine help.
I mean, how would you talk about, you know, do we talk, or maybe that's our problem, is we don't talk
I think
about
that's
Song
right.
of Solomon, and then
I think-
they're gonna get that information someplace else, right? Or they'll, so, but anyway, those two, at least those 2 dimensions, take about 10 minutes.
Okay, those folks that are online, I'll put you into a group and I will stop recording.
Yeah, that's right, stop recording.
Bobby, just
Let's have some fun. Well, let's make this a circle.
I can tell you one thing, it's not my favorite book, no. I like to say.
You can't find a plane, there is no plane. I said, I got seat number.
Yeah, see, I was confirmed, right? You're not in the.
All right, let's, all right, what,
Well, that's why King John Jones said he's the superior warlord. He doesn't use that.
so any insights, either online, those who are live streaming, or those who are here live, any insights from your group that you want to bring forward?
It made me, yeah, it made me think of my husband, you know, he's gone.
Yeah.
But just thinking about, you know.
Could you speak up, Marilyn?
Yeah, Marilyn, can you
It made me think about my husband.
Oh.
You know, who was gone. And we had a wonderful relationship, I thought, and I think he did too. I hope.
Can't check though, right?
Sure.
But it just kind of brought, it made memories back.
Oh, oh,
Cool.
that's wonderful.
Well, that was the same for me, and I kept thinking of Steve's funeral service for David. David, he said, we never thought of David as David, it was always David and Edie, one word.
Right.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah,
Often when you're that close, you have a certain love language together, right? That only, sometimes the family knows, sometimes the family doesn't know. You know, there's just certain, right, words, descriptions for each other. Positive. words. Positive words and descriptions for each other. We ran into this with my daughter. She has this lovely garden in her backyard, and she's got black-eyed Susans
Oh, I love
in
that.
the back, and she, I said, oh, you know, that was what my grandfather would call my grandmother. You're my little black-eyed Susan. And she kind of looked at me a little bit with disgust, like, you know, I'm a historian, that's why I planted them. She knew that, and that's why she plants black-eyed Susans. It's very symbolic of thinking of her great-grandparents and that little phrase that he'd always used for her, which is very nice. Now, the descriptions here, we would probably use different metaphors.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about 6, the bride's matchless beauty. You are beautiful as Tirzah, my love, comely as Jerusalem. You know, you're gorgeous like Chicago. Maybe you could have used, maybe you could have used New York before the Twin Towers fell. I don't know. But that's the idea. It's kind of using, it's a beautiful city. You're like Paris, I guess we could.
Yeah.
That would.
Or I left my heart in San Francisco.
Yeah, yeah.
Don't even.
I had a heart attack in the last few years.
Sitting by the side of the bay, right? Turn away your eyes from me, for they overwhelm me. Now that one you can still use probably, you know, every time you look at me, I'm just kind of overwhelmed by those big eyes of yours, whatever.
But this is interesting because my translation says, for they disturb me.
Really?
I think I like overwhelmed. I see it as more romantic. Disturb would be another, but he does use military metaphors here. It's one of the things I was going to point out that I thought was kind of interesting. I think what he's trying to say is you're strong, you're a strong woman. We'd say, yeah, you're a strong woman. Not that you're right, remind me of my army.
Right, exactly.
Now that might have been true, that might have been true, right? Maybe they weren't always, you know, kissing under the apple tree, but it's interesting. So your hair is like the flock of goats moving down the slopes of Gilead. I get that one, but it's not one we would use.
No.
But you can imagine how beautiful the goats are coming down, and she's got long, flowing hair. Yeah. Your teeth are like a flock of ewes. Again, not one we probably lean on, that have come up from washing. All of them bear twins, and not one among them is bereaved. In other words, she's got, you know,
She's got all the
she's
teeth.
got straight teeth. None of them are missing, you know? What's more romantic than that? Now, of course, when you're 90, then it means a lot more, you know? You got straight teeth and you still have the ball, yeah.
Rick?
Yeah.
Could Solomon be a window to look at sexual attitudes, romantic attitudes in other books? Is this an understanding that underlies other writings, or that people would relate to it more easily than I do? because it was part of the poetry, part of the expression.
Yeah, I think we are more film oriented, right? So we've seen a lot of romantic stories on film.
Yeah.
But if you went back 50 years, then it would be probably romantic poetry, right? You'd be leaning on the great poets to describe, and probably, if you fall in love with a woman or a man, you use lines from the poetry, right? From Yeats or,
Browning.
yeah.
Yeah, Browning.
Didn't you used to teach this stuff, right?
Yes.
And now we might quote a movie. So I think you're right. This would have been what someone did, right? You'd be surrounded by this poetry, but I don't know at what level you started reading this type of poetry. Were you a young man, young woman? Had what was the freedom to discuss certain romantic ideas? Because they didn't have dating.
Right.
So I don't know how this was used, sort of romantic poetry.
Well, Janet happens to have the Apocrypha in her Bible, and there's the piece in there on the wisdom of Solomon. And I really think when you take the wisdom of Solomon and the Song of Solomon and read them together, they make a lot of sense, because in the wisdom of Solomon, he's having a romantic affair with the Holy Spirit. It's truly a spiritual thing. There's none of the, erotic, romantic part here, but romance at a spiritual level. And she's giving him guidance about wisdom in the world. If you take the two and you marry these two together about Solomon, this makes a lot more sense.
Well, I have that in my Bible too, so.
Look at the passages on the Holy Spirit,
Carefully, Blair.
or sometimes it's Sophia. Sophia, he has a love affair with Sophia in some of the ways it's translated. And of course, Sophia is wisdom, and also known as the Holy Spirit.
So that's why Jewish commentators and Christian commentators have always gone the allegorical route. It sounds like that one's more of an allegory right from the beginning. It's not like we're allegorizing it. It's what it started as an allegory, or divine human relationships. And some have used this book the same way. I just find that more difficult, because it goes into great detail here about physical attributes. And now I guess you could extend that and say, oh God, you're mighty, you can go into a flowery language like we use in the prayers. But I think it flattens the book. There are six, I like this, your cheeks are like halves of pomegranate behind your veil. There are 60, verse 8 in chapter 6, there are 60 queens and 80 concubines and maidens without number. My dove, my perfect one, is the only one, the darling of her mother, flawless to her that bore her. I think this is the put down to Solomon. You've got all those women.
Yeah.
I've got one. That's all I need. The maidens saw her and called her happy, and the queens and the concubines also, and they praised her. Well, why do they say she's happy? Well, because she's fallen in love. I mean, it's the age-old story, right? You can have everything in the world, but you can't buy love. And so we admire someone who has experienced that. Who is this that looks forth like the dawn, fair as the moon, bright as the sun, terrible as an army with banners? That's just so interesting to move from sun and moon to army. But I think it's about strength.
Yeah.
Right?
I don't have that about the army. We have majestic as the stars in procession.
That would make more sense.
Yeah, but it connects with.
That's verse 10?
Yeah.
Who else has got a different translation there? Because he's taking a look at the firmament, that makes more sense than the stars and armies.
Chapter 8,
What chapter is it?
Chapter
6,
verse
verse 10.
Terrible as an army with banners.
Who is this that looks forth like the dawn, fair as the moon, bright as the sun, terrible as an army with banners? That, the reason I read it is it was bracing. It was so odd.
Well, Melissa uses different.
Yeah, my last line in that verse is majestic as the stars in procession.
And that's
I like
my
that.
Bible
I
says
like
that
that
too.
too.
Yeah.
What version do you have? What translation?
New. The new
RSV.
new IB, yeah.
Oh,
International version. New
Yeah, that-
international
Oh,
version.
international, that's what I have.
NIV.
That makes a lot more sense, actually. I went down to the nut orchard to look at the blossoms of the valley to see whether the vines had budded, whether the pomegranates were in bloom. Before I was aware, my fancy set me in a chariot beside my prince. Return, return, O Shulamite, return, return it. We may look upon you. Why should you look upon the Shulamite as upon the dance before two armies? Now, how does that?
Army. No, that's not right. Yeah,
Does it go to firmament?
no, I said, why would you gaze on the Shulamite as on the dance of Mahanaim?
That doesn't help.
No, Mahanaim is possibly a dance of unknown origin associated with the place of Mahanaim.
So it's interesting that in this version, he goes to the two armies both times. He uses the army metaphor on both of those.
Right.
And yours, it stays away from the army metaphor.
A dance.
How graceful are your feet in sandals, O queenly maiden, chapter 7.
I guess they didn't have high heels in those days.
But it's
It's
interesting that when you look at poetry, I think some poetry is universal, because when you read it, might be ancient Greek poetry. You get the metaphors immediately. And sometimes though you go, well, that's dated. That doesn't work anymore. So I like this one. Your navel, verse 2, your navel is a rounded bowl that never lacks mixed wine.
Oh.
What to say to a woman that will really,
He's pouring wine into her belly button.
Yeah.
Drinking it.
Too much information.
Yeah.
You gotta really understand what these translations are.
my guess is, this is just my guess, is what is he trying to say here?
Keep going.
I think when she dances, right, and her hips move, her belly moves, that's the
The belly
I get
dancing.
intoxicated. We'd say, I'm just
Sweet.
intoxicated by it. So, your belly's a heap of, oh yeah, your belly is a heap of wheat encircled with lilies. Now, I sometimes I just don't know what's going on there.
I think we're gonna get too risque if we go down that route pretty much.
But it's interesting, that's where the writer goes.
This sounds very like Sufi, if you've ever read Sufi.
Yes, it's very much so, but it's in detail. It's not just general, oh, you're so
You're
lovely.
beautiful.
Let's start from head to toe, right?
Yes.
Detail. I am my beloved's and his desires for me. Come, my beloved, let us go forth into the fields and lodge in the villages. Now, Matt may be right, that nothing happens, but nothing happens that we see
Right,
or they write about. But once you say, okay, come into the fields, this was
a little,
risque. Yeah. You didn't go there to pick apples.
no.
This is all written in metaphor.
That's
It's
all.
all metaphor.
But it would be when Jesus meets the woman at the well. That was a public spot. And why was it that men and women weren't seen together? Because it was a bit more risque. That was, be like, we met at a bar. Right, well, it's a hookup spot.
Yeah.
The well in Jesus' day was the hookup. It was the hookup spot. Here, it's, you go into the gardens, you go into some of these, especially fruit, fruit gardens, or it must have been beautiful, the buds on the nut trees, you can imagine,
Back to the garden.
back to the garden. So what do we pull out? Are you going to now read this more frequently, or have you had your fill of romantic imagery and you're ready to move on?
It's just love is a gift from God. I liked it. I mean, I probably won't read it weekly or anything, but yeah.
It's probably good that we don't know.
The whole time I was reading this, I was thinking of the last class I had when English literature at Otterbein, my alma mater. And the teacher was very stoic and scared me to death at times, but her last comment I will never, ever forget. And compassion meaning love. She had her hand like this and said, now, you will long forget the escapades of Don Juan. You will not remember the Shakespeare or the sonnets of Shakespeare. But this, I want you to remember. You are not an educated person until you have compassion or love for others. Close the book and out the door.
Great.
And I thought, if I did not get anything more out of my college education than that was the biggest gem in college I'd ever received.
It's
I
like,
think that's
we gotta close down the
really
Bible study
intriguing.
with a quote like that.
Oh,
That's-
yeah.
That quote is really intriguing in so many ways because it's about what does love really mean?
Mhm.
And I know,
Yeah.
Or education.
and reading
Education,
this and reading some of the other wonderful passages in the Bible, you start to realize that love is multidimensional. It's not like a single thing. And in the English language, it's kind of terrible unless you had verbs or adjectives and adverbs around the word love, because we kind of squeezed what the ancients understood as a multi-dimensional set of loves. And I wrote a piece and I wanted to leave it with you called The 10 Loves. And it was my study of what love really means. And I'll just mention the 10, and if anybody wants it, I've got it on the internet. There's spiritual love, romantic love, honorable love, friendship love, parental love, joyous love, philosophical love, labor of love, courageous love, neighborly love. Those are the 10 that are actually in the Bible, but they're not separated out as like separate things. And it's like learning to dance. If you want to learn to dance, you better learn a number of dance steps. You better know the waltz, the tango, the foxtrot, etc. If you want to love, we should be loving in the same way we're learning how to dance. You know, dance a number of steps. And
Stepping on each other's feet is where I was.
exactly, get the rhythm and the motion, you know, so that, you know, we really can tune into the world in a loving way.
So I have to share that, as you all know, Robert has really struggled with the word fear, the fear of the Lord. And so when Robert struggles, he usually goes and does a study. So this week he sent me a detailed study on the Greek etymology of the word fear and the Latin etymology of the word fear, which I think, to summarize, comes down to fear 1 and fear 2, as we were discussing here. There are 2 fears, one more troubling, and the other more positive, more elevating, that is used for God. Now, he comes up with some other conclusions to that, but it was fear 1 and fear 2, but they actually had different words, Hebrew words, Latin words, Greek words for those fears, but we don't in English. I think that's the point. We use fear for both of those, and therefore it makes it more difficult, as we found out here, to distinguish them. Now, that's the same point here. You know, it's the old snow illustration, right? If you're from Alaska, or if you're an Eskimo, you've got all these names for snow. If you're a skier, you have all these names for snow. But if you live in Florida, you only have one word.
Yeah.
Snow, and that's why we live down in Florida. Love is the same way. Love, the Greeks had the 3, were kind of classic, but then you always have to hear multiple sermons or Bible studies about, well, you got 3 types of love in the Greek, right? And Paul's referring to this and not to that. But we only have the one word, so then you gotta work a little harder to figure out
Which one?
what's being said and what's not being said. So
That's why it's so hard to teach English as a second language, because, you know, we have all these nuances and we have one word and it's pronounced 2 different ways.
Yeah.
Like, you must polish the Polish furniture. No, it's so hard.
It's complex.
It's because there's so many different languages thrown together, you know, there's the German in there, there's the French in there, there's the Greek in there,
Yeah.
and then you throw a little Spanish and a few other things and.
So I think here's what I'm pulling with this. Next week is big. It's Isaiah. I mean, now we're going We're going heavy again. But we know that during the pre-exile period was very formative, and all the Isaiah, Jeremiah are going to come out, all the prophets. Now, the stuff isn't written down, the books are not written down until either during or after the exile. But that's a formative period where almost everything we want to read from now to the next couple of weeks are going to be somehow related to those experiences of being conquered. And you're not going to get any romantic language other than Hosea, but that's Hosea will describe God's punishment, like his wife Gomer, who was unfaithful. But during this period of David and Solomon, we get a different type of literature. This is the high point of Israel. So David is praising God for allowing him to bring the country together, to unite the country, to build a temple, or almost build a temple. And so you get this psalm literature, which comes from his gifts, and then you get all this wisdom literature coming from Solomon. At least is the father of that literature. And so we read quite a few of those, right? And so David and Solomon here have a huge footprint in the Bible as far as their influence. Not that they wrote everything, because how many Psalms did David write in the Psalms? Matt?
50.
So 73. Oh, yeah, it took me a second, sorry.
73
Yeah.
Psalms. So it's not like they're writing everything. It's not like David wrote everything, Solomon wrote everything. But the idea of praise language still to this day being set by a guy who was king 3,000 years ago. That's pretty amazing. And having a whole set of literature, this wisdom literature, although it existed in the Near East everywhere, but still in our tradition, in the Jewish world, in the Christian world, it's set by Solomon. He sets the language, he sets the tone. That's pretty remarkable. And as Robert says, some of the stuff didn't make it into the Bible,
Right.
or made it in the Catholic Bible. But again, it's that influence of wisdom is part of our tradition, as well as lament, as well as romance. So that's pretty exciting. Isaiah next week. Now, Isaiah, I haven't looked ahead, but I can't, I'm not sure we can do all of that in one setting. So usually we divide it up into three: first Isaiah, second Isaiah, third Isaiah. We'll see how the best way to do that. I just haven't thought it through yet. Part of it is we're not going down into the weeds. We want to look at large topics about Isaiah and what's the best way to do that. So I'll just take a look at it this week. But this is another one of the most important books. It is in the Bible, but one we rarely do Bible study. We take snippets. We'll take a verse. We'll take maybe a chapter. We don't attack it because it's so laden in history that sometimes we just get lost in the dynamics. And so we'll see.
A lot of it is quoted in the New Testament.
Yes,
Right.
Isaiah.
Huge. I mean,
Yes.
had a huge influence on Jesus.
Yes.
So obviously he's done his Bible study on Isaiah.
Isaiah and Deuteronomy are
120 pages. I just looked, 66 chapters. Yeah, it's gonna be.
First Isaiah, I think is 1 to 39, so what, 40 to 59, I think is second Isaiah. And third is, I think the last 7, meaning we kind of got this with Solomon too, right? With sometimes I'm writing the book, but sometimes my students are writing, but they're writing to honor me. They're writing in my tone and with my emphasis, with my thematics. And so instead of saying, oh, I'm writing my own work, which was not done in the ancient world like it is today, they'd say, oh, I'm writing in Rick's name. Because I'm trying to reflect my teacher's thought. I'm trying to reflect my teacher's thinking. It's not my own thinking. So it gives honor to all right, let's close with a word of prayer. Good and gracious God, for all your gifts, we give you thanks for the sun and the moon and the stars and armies, and also for romance. For it all comes from your hand, and we receive it with gratitude. And we thank you for those who love and who have been loved, And we pray also that indeed we as the church would have this relationship with you as well. For indeed, you are the bridegroom and we are the bride. And we look forward to that day, that final day when indeed there's the big banquet feast. And we can praise and worship you with all the metaphors, with all the pictures, with all the adjectives, with all the nouns. For you, indeed, you are a great God. And we thank you for your faithfulness. Bless us on this day. We praise this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
May I ask a favor? And that is today, my care